Well, I'm delighted to be giving a second talk to the Theosophical Society. This is a follow-up to the talk I gave a little while ago, and it's on a closely related theme. And to remind you what I said in the first talk, I've got the same diagram with which I ended, which shows the three worlds of matter, mind, and spirit, and then this I, which signifies consciousness in the middle, because it's consciousness which actually links those worlds. And I will just briefly summarize some of the points I made in the first talk. I described the role of these three worlds in everyday life, but I also stressed the importance of building bridges between these three worlds. And I drew a distinction between how you bridge these worlds in your own personal life and the sort of requirement to have a conceptual link between these three worlds. And that's really the theme I'm going to be continuing to talk about today. I mean, where we hear a lot about the bridge between science and religion, which is the lower two circles, but the links between matter and mind and between mind and spirit are equally important. And the point is that this actually involves an extension of science, because whereas science is normally focusing on the matter world, I've argued that it has to be extended to cover mind, in other words, consciousness, and the various phenomena associated with mind. And then one needs to go one stage further. One also needs to expand the science to incorporate spirit, mystical experiences, if you like, because I made the point that there's a continuum between mind and spirit, and you can't make a clear-cut division between them. And I ended my last talk by arguing that we need a new paradigm, which is a new paradigm essentially of physics, which is going to be able to accommodate experiences in all three of these worlds. I pointed out that that is not something which physics currently describes, because physics has been tremendously successful in understanding the physical world from the smallest scale of quantum gravity to the larger scale of the multiverse. However, what is missing from the modern picture of physics is any reference to mind and consciousness. In fact, it could be described as the triumph of mindlessness, as opposed to mindfulness. And so what I want to do in this talk is to explain how physics can be extended to do that. Now, in my first talk, I gave various reasons why you might expect mind to be fundamental rather than incidental to the universe. I was referring to quantum theory and psychical phenomena and the anthropic principle, and I gave various general arguments for why we should expect to extend physics to accommodate mind and spirit. But those arguments were sort of rather indirect. And I want to now talk about an explicit model. And I say an explicit model because most of my arguments so far have been an argument for an implicit model of mind. I've argued that mind is implicit in physics because of quantum theory and the anthropic principle. But that's different from having an explicit model which incorporates mind. And I want a model which includes mind, normal mind. Sorry, I put psychedelic mind in because I gave a talk to some people interested in psychedelic experience. I meant to delete that. I don't know whether Theosophists approve of psychedelia, but I would normally go straight from normal to paranormal, but there's also spiritual. But since psychedelic is there, I will say I do feel that psychedelic experience does open one up to these greater realities. But I have to confess I'm not a great user of psychedelics myself. And so we need a new paradigm, and it's got to incorporate consciousness, a transcendence of space and time, because that will be one of the features of psychic and mystical experiences. And in some sense, it has to incorporate mental phenomena in some radically new way. So we sort of want a grand unified theory of matter and mind. And the key message in the last part of my talk is going to be that has to be a theory which involves higher dimensions. And so I might incorporate this little figure here, just to put this in context. Relativity theory amalgamated space and time to make space-time. Quantum theory amalgamates matter and mind to represent observation. So in some sense, that was the basis of relativity theory and quantum theory. In some sense, what we want is a unification of matter, mind, space and time. So that's what I want to present. That's what my new paradigm is. But it does involve a radical revision of what we mean by those terms, matter, mind, space and time. And let me start off by introducing you to straightforward physics again. In the standard Newtonian view of the universe, the arena of physical reality is three-dimensional space. So you've got the three dimensions are represented here. It's three dimensions because you can go left, right, forwards, backwards, up and down. So those are the three dimensions of space. And you've also got time. And in Newton's theory, both space and time are absolute. So space and time provide the arena of physical reality. And so associated with that is you could ask, what is the nature of reality? And this is a very simple interpretation of that. You would say that you've got, in the physical world, you've got two observers, two brains. Let's say there's a cat. The idea is that because of light signals and processes in the brain, we generate our internal image of a cat. So where two observers have the two cats, but there's only one physical reality. So the view of reality is there is a three-dimensional space in which are localized both the physical objects, the cat in this case and the brains, and the senses through which we observe the objects, the brains. Each observer has only partial information about this space, but there exists a three-dimensional configuration which gives two-dimensional projections concordant with those represented. So reality is a three-dimensional structure which reconciles our perceptions of it. So I hope that isn't too much of a mouthful, and let me just represent this by a little diagram here. So reality is this three-dimensional structure. I call it a reality structure, but different people at different places in this space see the world from different points of view and have different perceptual fields, and that's the standard view of classical physics, which most philosophers would adopt. But then, of course, Einstein came along with special relativity, and he said, no, the arena of reality is four-dimensional space-time. You have to merge space and time as four-dimensional space-time, and one consequence of that, time is the fourth dimension, and one consequence of that is that we objects, in particular human beings, we follow a sort of line in space-time. It's what's called the world line. And so a different time corresponds to a different slice. And so there is our world line, and we follow a world line or a world tube. And as time goes on, we sort of move around, our position changes in the space. So that's the Einstein view of reality, which is an important change of perspective. But we still have a model of reality, which is pretty much as before. Relativity theory implies that the physical world is four-dimensional, with the objects and observers being represented by world lines and perceptual fields being three-dimensional. They're what are called past light cones. Physical reality is a four-dimensional structure which reconciles our perceptions on it. So here's a picture which might be a little bit too complicated, but this is the so-called light cone. And the brain has a world line. We look back through our eyes on the past light cone. The cat is another world line, and we perceive it where its world line intersects our light cone. So maybe that's a little bit technical, but I just want to get across the idea that perception is more complicated from a four-dimensional point of view, but still pretty straightforward, and this is standard physics. And so we can still use that sort of picture I had before. It's just that the reality structure is four-dimensional and the perceptual field is like a three-dimensional projection rather than a two-dimensional projection. So let me leave it at that stage, because that in some sense is standard physics. There's nothing controversial about that. But now physics, though, has gone further than that. Physics has taught us there could be higher dimensions. And actually this goes back to the 1920s, after Einstein's general relativity theory. General relativity theory had provided a geometrical interpretation of gravity as the curvature of space-time. Kaluza-Klein, 10 years later, that's two people, they said, well, maybe there can be a fifth dimension which unifies gravity and electromagnetism. But the only thing is this fifth dimension has to be compactified on the Planck scale, which is this. The Planck scale is the smallest scale you can have. It's 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. That's a bit hard to visualize. Even four dimensions are hard to visualize. But the way to think of this is, imagine this is a hose, if you like, and the spatial dimensions have all been compactified to one dimension. So the length of this tube is the three spatial dimension. And then you've got another compactified dimension, which is actually the fifth dimension. I've got rid of two of the spatial dimensions and the time dimension, just so you can envisage this. And of course, we don't see the extra dimension because it's much smaller than the wavelength of light. So from afar, in other words, from our perspective, you don't even know there is this extra dimension, but it's there, and it's compactified on a scale which is much smaller than the wavelength of light, so you can't possibly see it. And actually that provides a beautiful unification of electromagnetic theory and gravitational theory. But actually physicists more or less forgot about it for the next 60 years because they were distracted by quantum theory and things like that. But then in 1984, superstrings came along and they said, well, actually there's 6 compactified dimensions. And so you've got 10 dimensions in total. You've got the 4 macroscopic dimensions, 3 space and 1 time, but you've also got 6 internal dimensions. And those internal, because by then we knew there are more forces than just electromagnetism. We've got all the weak and nuclear forces to explain as well. But then it was realized that actually there are quite a lot of superstring theories. And it was realized in 1995 by Witten, whose picture I showed earlier, that you can, in some sense, amalgamate these different superstring theories by saying there's actually an extra dimension, a 7th dimension. So you now have an 11-dimensional model. Now, this is all hard to visualize, but I'm just trying to get across the idea that physicists do talk about higher dimensions. So here is a little summary of the higher dimensions. You start off with 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 10 dimensions, and then 11 dimensions. So the implication of this is that physics gives a sequence of paradigms with increasing dimensionality. And this is summarized in this diagram here, where we go from the 3-dimensional Newtonian view to the 11-dimensional view of M theory. Now, obviously, this is in conflict with common sense. Our common sense reality is really the 3-dimensional Newtonian view. But the point I'm making is that the ultimate reality, as revealed by modern physics, or at least this theory of modern physics, is completely beyond common sense reality. And that may make you uncomfortable, and it's obviously not so easy to understand, to think in terms of these higher dimensions, but that is the price you pay for unification. If you want to have a unified understanding of the physical world, you have to depart from common sense reality. But there's one particular version of M theory which I like. It's called the Randall-Sundrum picture, and this says, well, let's imagine one of these dimensions is not compactified on the Planck scale, but is actually extended. In this case, you could say that our physical world, our 4-dimensional world, which is called a brane, B-R-A-N-E, is a sort of slice of a 5-dimensional world, which is called the bulk. So the extra dimension is this fifth dimension, which is, we've just expanded one of these extra dimensions. So this gives us the view that the physical world is in some sense just a slice of a higher dimensional world. So let me just leave it at that. Now let's get back to the problem of mind and spirit. What I'm going to argue is that in our new paradigm, we're going to need space and time for mind and spirit, and this is going to be the crucial message. But it's not the usual space and time, and this is Descartes, who of course was the great philosopher who's speculated about the relationship between our perception of the world and the world itself. And what I'm going to say, to give you the message, is that one needs what I call a universal structure, which is a sort of higher dimensional reality structure, which accommodates normal, paranormal, and spiritual mental phenomena. And remember, that was the aim I set this paradigm to accommodate those three types of phenomena. Now, let us go back to the four-dimensional view of reality, which we get from Einstein's special relativity. You remember the point about that is that we get our information of the universe by perceiving along the path light cone. We see light which comes in through the path light cone from the object to our eyes. So that corresponds to a sort of, in space-time, this is just showing one dimension of space, that corresponds to a sort of the path light cone, which is indicated by this solid line. But we also experience the world in all sorts of other ways, not only through light, we experience sound and touch and all sorts of signals. But basically, the way we experience the world is through all these, it's like a nexus of signals which connect to the world line of our brain. So in some sense, phenomenal space is the part of space-time connected to the brain, which is the world line of, the brain has the world line terminating at a particular time at this point here, connected to the brain by the causal signaling network. And that includes neuronal processes, so that anything going on in the brain is also part of this. And in some sense, that's just a space-time representation of standard physics. But also it corresponds to a sort of extended mind, in which our phenomenal space, what we experience, is a part of space-time. And I want you to contrast that with the sort of the standard view, which in some sense the percept is in the brain. So here is the view where, when you look at the, in my original picture it was a cat, now it seems to be naked ladies or something, but it was originally a cat. But the point is, the normal view is that your brain produces a sort of image inside the brain of the object which is outside. Before it was a cat. But actually, I'm saying that isn't correct in a four-dimensional perception, because in the four-dimensional perception, the percept is not actually in the brain. It's in some sense represents a connection with space-time itself. So you have to think of perception as a four-dimensional process, and the object and the brain are just two ends of a four-dimensional chain. And it seems to me that even philosophers haven't really caught on to this very clearly, that it's completely different from the normal three-dimensional view of perception, which makes this distinction between the cat in the brain and the cat in the world. From a four-dimensional perspective, it's just perception is four-dimensional. So when I look at a distant star, the percept of the star isn't in my head, it is the star. And it's just that there is a four-dimensional link between the star and my brain. Perception is a four-dimensional process. So bear that in mind. Now, so what does that mean about memory, for example? I mean, the standard view, of course, is that the memories are generated by the brain and are therefore inside the head. But if the percept isn't in the head, how can the memory be in the head? I mean, if I look at something, close my eyes and then envisage it, how can the scene in the memory be in the head if the percept isn't? So there's an alternative view which says that memories of physical events reflect direct access of consciousness to the space-time which contains the event. So the experiences are in some sense external. So I can draw a picture. This is the same picture I had before, but showing the nexus of connections more precisely. The idea is that if you have a memory, is that the memory is essentially re-experiencing the past. So obviously there is information in the brain, but the idea is that the brain contains a tag rather than a trace. So in other words, in a sense, your memory is linking you to a point in space-time. And the brain links you to that point as a tag, but the brain itself, and the brain can replicate the information to some extent, but in some sense the memory is not uniquely in the brain, the memory is actually in the space-time structure itself, and might in principle even survive after the brain dies. Now again, this is not the standard view of memory, but I would say that the argument that the memory itself is contained in the brain is not conclusive. But now let's think about other types of mental experiences, because so far I've just been talking about the physical world. What about dreams? I mean, dreams take place in a space. I mean, I have very vivid dreams, I have lucid dreams, and sometimes I'm not even sure if I'm dreaming or not. I hope I'm awake now. But the point is, dream has a space. And Price, a philosopher, he said, he proposed that physical events and dream events exist in different space-times. And he said, we inhabit two worlds simultaneously, the world of common experience, governed by physical laws, and another space quite as real, which obeys other laws. Continuous dream life goes on throughout our waking hours, and occasionally we may catch a glimpse of it. C.D. Broad, who was a philosopher of the 20th century, in fact at my college at Trinity, he went further and said maybe we should merge dream and phenomenal spaces into a single space of more than 3 dimensions, in which sensations of all kinds exist. And so we're now applying the concept of space to different types of mental experiences, not only ordinary phenomenal space, which is the perceptual space associated with the physical world and memories. In fact, you might ask, is there a space for psychic experiences? And my argument is going to be there is. For example, if we believe in telepathy, that says that even non-physical percepts, like the image of the cat in my mind, have attributes of externality. So there's a sort of communal mental space. On the other hand, if you believe in clairvoyance, the idea I can see physical objects but not through the normal physical channels, this says physical objects in some sense have attributes of internality. So in some sense, mental space contains physical space. So in some sense, you're going to be marrying up mental space, which is thought of as being internal, with physical space, which is thought of as being external. There are other psychic experiences which can be thought of in the same way. They're so-called threshold experiences, which are experiences you have on the threshold of sleep, sometimes associated with sleep paralysis, where you will see things and feel things and hear things which aren't really physical but seem real. But they seem to take place in a physical space. This is a book by Hufford, The Terror That Comes in the Night. This is the image of the beast which is sitting on your chest, and you feel the weight on your chest. Of course, you can say it's an hallucination, but it's an experience, and it seems to involve space and something which is rather similar to physical space. Apparitions, of course, people claim most people would claim apparitions are hallucinations. There are claimed ghost pictures, but they're not always convincing. But the thing is that it's not as simple as that, because sometimes you have collective apparitions where more than one person see the ghost, as though it really does exist in a space, even though it's not physical space. We have out-of-body experiences. Again, you could say it's an illusion, hallucination, but there's no doubt that people think they're leaving their bodies. They seem to wander around the physical world, and sometimes they even see things in the physical world and report them, which we might say was due to clairvoyance. Sometimes they even access higher planes which are beyond the physical, but they involve a space. Near-death experiences, they often start with an out-of-body experience, but then they also involve going through a tunnel and maybe encountering loved ones who've died and having some link with memories. But again, it involves a space. So there is the tunnel. The tunnel is obviously a spatial concept. And then mystical experience. Well, mystical experiences, of course, there are many types of mystical experiences. They involve a sense of unity and transcendence of space and time, a deeper sense of reality. But many of them, the so-called extraversive ones, they involve, again, a space. Not all mystical experiences, but some do involve some form of space. But it's not physical space. And so the message is you need a space which is not the same as physical space, but relates to it, and somehow unifies phenomenal space, memory space, dream space, ESP space, and all these other spaces. This is the model I'm proposing. I'm not saying it's correct, and I'm not saying most of my physics colleagues would believe this. So how does one do this? Well, the idea is that you remember I talked about reality as being a three-dimensional structure with Newton's theory and a four-dimensional structure with Einstein's theory. I'm proposing that mental experiences can be accommodated in a higher-dimensional structure, reality structure, which in some sense reconciles our different experiences of the world, but not just physical, material experiences. And the point is it has a sort of hierarchical structure which incorporates physical space. So physical space is part of it. But it also incorporates non-physical parts, which can be accessed only by non-physical senses, if you like. So I have a way of representing this. You remember that originally I said that you can represent perception as being a four-dimensional reality structure in which the individual experiences or perceptual fields are lower dimensional perceptual fields represented by squares. What I'm doing is I'm sort of extrapolating to a higher dimensional reality structure, which I'm calling the universal structure. Now, the number of dimensions is not specified here. I'm calling it D, but this is what's called a hypercube. This is a four-dimensional cube, but that's just a symbol. And the idea is your non-physical perceptual fields will represent them by cubes, but they're not really cube. It's just an analogy. So the idea is that you have ordinary physical perceptions. We expand that to include our non-physical perceptions, and we say that there is a universal structure which reconciles our different experiences. So in some sense, the physical, four-dimensional physical space-time is mapping into this high-dimensional reality structure. And so this, in some sense, corresponds to the idea that you have a sort of universal mind. In other words, a communal reality. We're not separate minds. And then the next stage is to identify this higher dimensional structure with the higher dimensional structure of M theory. And in particular, you remember this, there was a view of M theory where the physical world is a slice in this higher dimensional brane. Well, that's just what this is, because this space-time is just a slice in the higher dimensional brane, except it's not necessarily five-dimensional. Well, obviously, mathematically, this is quite a complicated thing to describe, because even 4 dimensions is quite difficult. But I'm saying this is the sort of conceptual framework you need in order to accommodate mental, psychic, and spiritual phenomena. Now, in some sense, this idea isn't new. I think even within the Theosophical tradition, you have the idea that you have, higher dimensions and different planes of reality. But the point is, this is coming from the direction of physics. I'm trying to link it up with physics and saying that physics also has these higher dimensions, and that therefore you're bound to ask, if you've got this higher dimensional bulk and the material world is just a slice of it, what else is there? And I'm simply saying, well, what else is there? Our mental experiences. So although it's a rather radical proposal, it doesn't seem to me illogical. But I have to stress that most physicists will think this is nonsense. M theorists will not be at all pleased at the idea that I'm associating their model with mental experience, let alone psychic experiences. Because M theorists, have some trouble convincing even more mainstream physicists that their theory is proper physics and not just maths, and associating that theory with something as heretical as psi phenomena will not go down well at all. So I don't want to give the impression that this is the mainstream view. It's a very heretical view, and many of my mainstream physics colleagues would probably have me burnt at the stake if I talked about this. So I wouldn't talk about this in a physics seminar, for example. Nevertheless, I think this is the way one has to go. Now, in the last part of my talk, if I've got time, I want to just say something about what are these extra dimensions. Because in my particular approach, they're to do with time. And what I'm going to say now is even more controversial than what I've said so far. Well, what I've said so far is pretty heretical. What I'm going to say now is sort of heretical squared. And it's to do with the nature of time. And that's what I'm going to finish off with. Because really, I've said you need a space for these mind. You also need a time for mind. But it's not the normal physical time. And let me explain what I mean by that. There are two problems associated with time. One is to do with the flow of time, and one is to do with what's called the specious present. And these are both intimately linked to consciousness. So again, this may be a little bit technical, but let me just give you the overview. The point is that consciousness involves a flow of time. So if I take my space-time diagram, and imagine this is the time, this line here is the word line of the brain, we think of consciousness, the passage of time, as the consciousness moving up this line. It's like a ring, a bead moving on a wire. So intuitively, that's what we think. So it was 1 o'clock an hour ago, it's 2 o'clock now, it will be 3 o'clock in an hour's time. We think of the passage of time as an arrow along the world line. But the only trouble is, and the other thing is, we somehow imagine that we can make decisions. So, for example, I'm going for a walk, I decide whether to go left or right or carry on in a straight line. And we have the intuitive idea that I can select a future world line, even though the past world line is fixed. But the trouble is, Einstein's block universe does not describe this flow of time, because past, present, and future coexist. So in standard physics, there is no flow of time. In some sense, relativity, because it merges space and time, space-time is frozen. So there is no flow of time in standard classical physics. And even quantum theory doesn't solve that problem. The role of time in quantum theory is more complicated, but there is a solution. And one solution was proposed by C.D. Broad. He said, well, let's imagine that there is a fifth dimension. And this fifth dimension, in some sense, corresponds to mental time as opposed to physical time. And then you can imagine that at any moment in physical time, you've got a four-dimensional reality structure, S4. You've got your possible world lines. You select a possible world line, and at your next stage, you've gone to another point in space, but we've now got another decision. And so these decisions represent the interaction of mind in the physical world. And this higher time relates to mind. It's your mental time as opposed to physical time. And so he argued that this extra time can actually describe the passage of time. So you're going beyond ordinary relativity theory. Well, you remember I told you about brane theory, that our world is a brane in a higher dimensional bulk. In brane cosmology, which is a bit more complicated, you sort of have an arrow, which means the brain moves through the fifth dimension. And so I would argue that the fifth dimension actually is what you require to explain the passage of time. Okay, so this is saying there's a link between the extra dimension and time. But now let's go on to the next problem. Well, so in some sense, this gives you a five-dimensional psychophysical space. This diagram might be a little bit complicated, but the line is space. This line, horizontal line, is space. Physical space-time corresponds to this plane here with T1 as the axis. So I'm outlining it with my mouse. But then perpendicular to that is your perceptual space, which has the T2 time. So it's a unified psychophysical space. Now, I'm sorry, this is probably a little bit hard to visualize and maybe understand, but I just want to get across the idea that going to the fifth dimension can bring in mind and the passage of time. However, it still doesn't solve the problem completely. There's the problem of the specious present. Now, the specious present is the shortest time we can experience. It goes back to 1882, someone called Kelly. The present is really a part of the recent past, delusively experienced as being a time that intervenes between the past and future. Let it be named the specious present. And the person who developed this idea further was William James, the famous psychologist. The prototype of all conceived times is the specious present, the short duration of which we are immediately and incessantly sensible. So it's the smallest time we can experience, which for a human being is just about something like 1/10 of a second. We simply can't be. One way of imagining this is that if you imagine a light is going around in a circle, you can see it moving around in a circle. But if it goes round more than 10 times a second, you can't actually see the motion. You just see a continuous circle. And so in some sense, space has become time, because 1/10 of a second is a sort of minimum time scale in which you can experience the flow of time. But the point is, the specious present can vary in some circumstances. I mean, I said it's 1/10 of a second, but it does vary. For example, if you're a trapeze artist, your specious present becomes smaller because you see the world in slow motion. You've got to catch the hand of the person who's depending on you to save his life. On the other hand, if you're a balance artist where you have to hold your poise for a long time, the specious present actually increases, so that what seems like 5 minutes to the outside world only looks like 10 seconds to you. It can be more dramatic in some circumstances. You can be in a crisis, for example, if you're in a car accident, time can slow down. Or you might have a fever, the case of somebody who saw this flashing light by the window and he finally realized that it was a rising and setting of the sun, but because his specious present has increased, that actually it seemed to be much more rapid. There's a famous poem by Rupert Brooke in which he's pouring tea for his lover and suddenly time freezes and he has a mystical experience. So again, the specious present has basically just suddenly decreased. And then there's the, if you have a near-death experience, you can have a life review where you see your whole life actually almost instantaneously. So your specious present has expanded. Because the point is, within the specious present, there is no distinction between past and future. So this is a very dramatic increase in the specious present. Your whole lifetime becomes less than a specious present. And drugs can have the same effect. I won't talk about drugs. But there are also even more, more dramatic changes in the specious present in mystical experiences. When people have mystical experiences, this is a quote from Ed Kelly, who edited those books I referred to earlier from Esalen. There is an interesting similarity between the description of mystical experiences produced through the stages of samadhi, characterized by Patanjali, and an early anatomist twisting the focus of a microscope. It's as though the meditator is adjusting the focal length of his instrument and encountering systematically different worlds depending on the settings achieved. So this comes from Yemeni, The Science of Yoga. I think he was a theosophist. And so when you analyze some of these mystical experiences, it's as though the specious present is changing. And indeed, sometimes you can have such a dramatic change in the specious present. The specious present may expand to infinity, so even the whole history of the universe somehow is experienced simultaneously. Or it may shrink to zero, so only now exists. And in some funny way, rather like the cosmic Ouroboros, which was for space, those two states seem to be equivalent. But the point is this: if the And it may be that there is a state of pure consciousness at the final stage where you transcend space and time altogether. You see, people often say when they're having these experiences they transcend space and time, but I would say that they're merely at a different type, accessing a different type of space and time where the specious present has changed. This is just a theory. I'm not saying it's true, but it fits in quite nicely. And so, and you see that the real question is, what is the nature of identity? If we believe there is only one mind, with a big M, how is that one mind fragmented into little individual minds with a little m? Because it's only at the level of the individual mind that we are experiencing the passage of time. And what I'm saying is that the passage of time is associated with your self-identity, and that is associated with a specious present. So I'm saying it's the fragmentation of big mind into little mind is all connected with the natures of the specious present. And I've got a little diagram here to try and describe that. What is now, in other words, what determines your position on the world line of your brain relates to the question of who am I? The two problems are the same. One is in space and one is in time, if you see what I mean. And let me try and represent this by this diagram here. This is the three individuals, and they've got their past, you know, this is their, what I call the outlook tree, the nexus of space-time connections. When I say who am I, I'm saying why am I connected with one particular nexus? And the point I'm saying is that this separate identity only exists in this lower dimensional space. And if you think of the higher dimension, because this is the ordinary physical space, if I think in terms of the higher dimension, then these can be connected. They can be seen as fragments of this one higher level of consciousness. But the point is that also the identity is associated with just a narrow range of timescales. This identity only makes sense with respect to the specious present we're used to of a tenth of a second or whatever. If you're on if your specious present is much larger than that, there's no identity. I am only Bernard Carr with respect to that specious present of a tenth of a second or whatever it is. With regard to a specious of present which is much longer than my lifetime, say, I'm at a higher level of identity which transcends Bernard Carr. And so, from my perspective, the nature of identity is intrinsically linked to the nature of the specious present. And although it's very speculative, in my approach, I associate these extra dimensions, I associate these hierarchy of extra dimensions which are closed, in some sense, with a hierarchy of specious presence. So I have the idea of consciousness coming in hierarchies. You know, we have the very arrogant view that the only form of consciousness in the universe is human consciousness, which has a specious presence of a second. I don't see why consciousness cannot exist on a wide range, with a wide range of specious presence. Maybe a computer has a specious presence of a nanosecond. Maybe some galactic intelligence has a specious presence of 1,000,000 years. And we wouldn't know. We wouldn't be able to interact with them because you only can interact with identities which have the same specious present. All this is incredibly speculative. It could all be wrong. Most of my physics colleagues will think it's crazy, but I'm just saying it to you because I think within the Theosophical tradition these ideas aren't so crazy. And so, in fact, I don't see why there shouldn't be an evolving hierarchy of consciousness. You know, here's our human consciousness with a specious present. I've written it now as a hundredth of a second, but somewhere between a hundredth and a tenth of a second. In some sense, I think you could argue that the planet has a level of consciousness. After all, it has a collective memory and a collective intelligence and a collective plans, etc. It has many. I'm not saying it has consciousness, but if it has, it's obviously on a much longer time scale, and maybe there is even a galactic level of consciousness. I mean, if we are I believe there probably are extragalactic civilizations. Once we make contact with them, we become part of a sort of galactic internet, and we'll be operating on a galactic level of consciousness, and the galactic species present might be still longer. And then, of course, finally, there might be a cosmic level of a cosmic species present whose timescale was like the age of the universe. So I don't see in principle why there can't be a hierarchy of consciousnesses all operating with a different species present, a hierarchy of species present. And in my particular model, I associate those species presents with these extra dimensions. And so what I've said is these extra dimensions, I've argued you need these extra dimensions in order to accommodate normal, paranormal, and mystical experiences. Those extra dimensions are associated, they link with physics, but in this model they are in some sense time-like, and they're compactified, and the scale of the compactification is associated with the species present. So let me conclude this very long talk by saying the extended space and time plays a crucial role in linking matter, mind, and spirit, and in relating individual to universal mind. And so I've got this picture of the bridge. Remember, my original aim was to bridge the three worlds of matter, mind, and spirit. So this is the bridge. And I'm arguing that actually what provides the bridge is higher dimensions of space and time. And so this sort of links matter and mind, it links science and spirituality. In some sense, I would claim that this is what must underline this science, which is going to accommodate all the three worlds of matter, mind, and spirit. And I'm just going to end with a quote from I think a well-known theosophist, Paul Brunton. We must learn to mentalize space and spatialize mind, which in a certain sense is the message of my particular paradigm.